Now, the United Nations has been under intense pressure to get more aid into Syria's rebel-held northwest. It says 58 trucks have crossed from Turkey through the Bab al-Hawa crossing during the past week, but it will start sending others now that it has permission from Syria's government.
I hope Assad is serious about this. Of course, it hasn't been only Russia that's been opposed to this in the past. The Assad regime has consistently argued against additional humanitarian crossings. But if the regime is serious about this, and if the regime is willing to put those words into action, that would be a good thing for the Syrian people.
Now, there are still some stories for survival. In Turkey, 2 brothers have been pulled from under the rubble after being trapped for more than 198 hours. That's 8 days. The 17 and 20-year-olds were rescued in Kahramanmaraş. Rescue teams in both Turkey and Syria are now winding down operations in the vast area as chances of finding any more survivors are fading. More than 1 million people have been left homeless in the region, with aid organizations warning this number could be much higher.
NATO defense ministers will meet in Brussels to discuss how to supply Ukraine with arms and training its military needs to fend off a renewed Russian offensive. NATO Secretary General called on the allies to increase production to replenish Europe's diminished stockpiles. Jens Stoltenberg said the war in Ukraine has now become a race of logistics, with both Moscow and Kyiv facing huge challenges to keep the supplies of ammunition and weapons flowing to the front line. Mr. Stoltenberg confirmed that Ukraine's current rate of ammunition expenditure is many times higher than the rates of production within member states. The meeting comes ahead of the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion.
Next week we mark the first year of the terrible war in Ukraine, the full-fledged invasion by Russia against Ukraine. And we see no signs that President Putin is preparing for peace. What we see is the opposite. He is preparing for more war, for new offensives and new attacks. So it makes it just even more important that NATO allies and partners provide more support to Ukraine, and we will meet later on today in the US-led contact group for Ukraine and address the urgent needs for increased support to Ukraine. Not least the need to provide more ammunition and also how to ramp up production and strengthen our defense industry to be able to provide the necessary ammunition to Ukraine and also to replenish our own stocks. So yes, the type of support has evolved, and that's part of the ongoing consultations among allies within NATO, within the Ukraine support group, and it will continue because we need to ensure that Ukraine gets the weapons it needs to be able to retake territory, liberate the lands, and win this war and prevail as a sovereign independent nation.
All right, now for more on this, we can now speak to Arise chief correspondent John Cookson, who's monitoring developments from London. Hello, John. A very warm welcome to the program. Almost 1 year to the day that this war started, and it looks like President Zelensky's most recent charm offensive is paying off. What are the developments?
Hi guys, great to be on Newsday as always. Yes, you're right. Zelensky was in Europe recently, went to London, Paris and Brussels. Basically urging Western nations to give him the weaponry to what he says will win the war, and that includes warplanes. And that's very much number one issue, I think, on the agenda today for this regular meeting of NATO defence ministers, which includes Lloyd Austin, the Defence Secretary from the United States, and Ben Wallace, British Defence Secretary. And the issue is whether to supply the warplanes that Zelensky is asking for. He says he wants around 300 warplanes, and it seems that the Europeans have and other NATO members have possibly 100 to 150 to spare. The big question is which planes will be supplied, what will be the training periods, how will Ukrainians be trained on them, how to fly the Typhoons from the UK, the F-16s from the US, and Eurofighters from European NATO countries. So this is a major item for NATO to discuss. Formally, they haven't decided yet to supply these warplanes, and there are countries, including Turkey and Hungary, and Germany to some extent, who is very concerned about the supply of warplanes to Ukraine at this point. The other item on the agenda is the rapid assimilation of both Sweden and Finland into NATO. Now, their membership is being fast-tracked, which is seen in some quarters, and certainly by Russia, as a red rag to the Russian bull, if you like, because it would be a further encroachment of NATO member nations into Putin's backyard, as it were. Hungary and Turkey in particular, against SWIFT membership of Sweden and Finland. The reason for that is because Sweden and Finland has given home to many Kurdish economic migrants and other refugees from the north of Iraq, and Turkey regards these people as, in their words, as terrorists. There's an ongoing war between notably the PKK Kurdish terrorist group, as the Turks would describe them, and Turkey itself. It's a war that's been going on for more than 40 years. So for that reason, Turkey is opposed to Sweden and Finland's membership of NATO. Now, that's not to say that the Turks won't change their mind at some point. Turkey, of course, an important member of NATO, where there are a number of important NATO bases. So Turkey is an essential member of NATO. So we'll have to wait and see whether the other members can persuade Turkey to lift its opposition to Sweden and Finland's membership of NATO. And the other subject you touched on briefly there in that soundbite from Jens Stoltenberg is that there's concern in Europe and other NATO countries that the amount of weaponry that's going or being promised to Ukraine is depleting NATO stocks. For example, the Ukrainians are thought to be firing about 5,000 rockets a week. Well, Western nations, including the US, only make 1,000 rockets a week. So now the Ukrainians are starting to use rockets that are in NATO's arsenal, as it were, that are on standby. So that's another issue for NATO defense ministers to talk about today. So big issues and an important meeting coming, as I say, recently after Zelensky's visit to Europe.
Well, thank you, John. Just wondering if you think that this, whatever the outcome of this meeting might be, that it might trigger a response from Russia.
I think we're probably beyond that. Russia tends to go its own way. We've seen that it can mount aerial attacks in Ukraine almost at will. There's a massive fight going on in the southeast of Ukraine over Bakhmut. And Putin tends not to react to developments as far as NATO's decisions are concerned. He kind of goes his own way. In the past, not Putin, but lower-ranking members of the elite in Moscow have said there will be a reaction from Russia to an uptick in NATO's efforts to help Ukraine. But so far, generally speaking, that has not happened. Putin is conducting his own war his own way.
Absolutely, and we see Russia preparing for those drills that will be taking place with China and South Africa in Cape Town and Richards Bay later on. Now, when we look at the escalation from NATO's side and their willingness to become more active from a military standpoint, 1 year later, is it possible that we can now be confident that an escalation of this war is now inevitable?
I'm afraid you're right. The fresh Russian assault on Ukraine has already begun. NATO members have accepted that. Russia pouring thousands of troops into the region down in the southeast. Huge losses on all sides over the battle for example, Bakhmut. The Ukrainians have lost hundreds of men. It's estimated in the West that the Russians are currently losing around 800 fighters a day, which is a massive toll on the Russian military effort there. Many of them members of the so-called Wagner mercenary group. Wagner works to no rules, really. They act by themselves, as it were, doing Putin's dirty work, conducting some of the most serious fighting, and they've done that in the past in countries like Syria and on the continent of Africa. So the Wagner Group in the front line at the moment, down in the southeast, suffering horrendous losses at the moment. One military expert saying they were like lemmings going over a cliff as they form part of this massive war machine. So I'm afraid, yes, we are looking, as the first anniversary on the 24th of the invasion comes, we are seeing a big uptick in the war effort on both sides, both the Ukrainians and the Russians. The Ukrainians, of course, about to be get a lot of more support from countries in the West, a lot more supplies of tanks and other weaponry, but that's going to take some weeks to get on the ground and to get them, the Ukrainian forces, trained into using Western tanks. But for all those reasons, yes, you're right. This war is, I'm afraid, reaching a more dangerous phase.
Well, it's unfortunate, but that's indeed the reality. Thank you so much, Arise Chief Correspondent John Cookson, for your analysis. We appreciate you as always.